Praise the Lord. I want to share a simple message with us tonight. Sunday nights are for simple messages, right? Nothing earth-shattering or theological. This time, we'll save that for the future. But I want to speak tonight concerning the influence of grace. In fact, that's the title of the message tonight, the influence of grace. Grace, of course, in our day is misunderstood, and I think because of that, grace kind of gets a bad rap, right? We spend so much time debating grace that maybe we don't spend enough time appropriating it. But I want to just share with you something that happened to me, and I give it as a testimony because it's not, to me, it's not an unusual occurrence. It actually has kind of, for me, it's kind of become a way of life. And I'm careful how I say that because I don't want it to say it in such a way that it's something that I possess. I know it's the grace of God. But Rebecca will testify that I have, if you asked her, she would testify. She's not going to give a testimony on her own. But that I have some clients that I really love working with. And they are a joy to me. I get excited every time I see them or I know that I'm going to go to audit them. I'm perhaps a lot more excited about seeing them than they are about seeing me, I'm sure. But then there are other clients that are not pleasant to me. And it's my job, I do it, and that's fine, that's the way it is. But there's one client, and I don't often use the word odious, but he's odious to me. He's not a wicked, vile person. It's not that kind of odiousness. He's irritant. He's very belligerent. He's very obnoxious. He's probably a decent man otherwise. But so I was bemoaning it to Rebecca, and this is the part that she could testify to. I was bemoaning it to Rebecca, and I said, I am not looking forward to this at all. And months in advance, I'm already tightening up in my spirit. I have to pray for grace when I meet this person. And I'm speaking ambiguously here because I came to find out actually some of my clients go on YouTube and listen to my messages, so I have to be very careful what I say. But at any rate, he's very grating, very odious. Again, I'm not saying he's a wicked man. It's just everything you say he challenges. Everything you say he gives disagreement to. And when you're there for 5 days, 8, 9 hours a day, it gets old. And so I'm bemoaning to Rebecca. This is all about grace, by the way. And I'm bemoaning it to Rebecca. And then I said, I don't know, maybe a week before the audit, I said to Rebecca, you know what? I'm going to get my head in the right place. I'm going to get my heart in the right place. I'm going to pray for grace. God's going to give it, and I'm actually going to enjoy myself. Now, I predicted that would happen. And so, the day comes, and I show up, and I'm being honest with you folks. I was excited to see him. I was. I saw him, and we waxed eloquent in conversation, and in fact, I told Becky in the middle of the week, I'm having fun with this guy. It was the same guy he always been, challenging everything I said, and I don't want to give too many details because, again, some of my clients hear my message. If you're listening to my message, you're one of my clients, there's a real strong possibility you're not the person I'm talking about. But, but here's the thing. I enjoyed it so much that I asked him, I said, would you go out to dinner with me tonight? We should go out to dinner. And we actually went out to dinner, and we had a blast. It was a fun time. Now, what's the point of the message? The point of the message is this. The influence of grace came into my life and changed things. Didn't change the individual, didn't change the circumstances, but somehow it changed me. The influence. And, we understand something concerning grace. We all understand that we're saved by grace through faith, right? It's a gift of God, a gift, something given to us so that none of us can boast. That's one component of grace. But you know what I've come to understand about grace? The most important, if I could say this, day-to-day living with grace to me means that it's an influence. Grace is an influence. Grace influences us in the right direction. Now, how do I know that this was grace and I just then all of a sudden, like this fellow? because somewhere on Friday around noon, the grace started to lift. Now, my audit ended Friday at noon, and so somewhere around 11:45, I couldn't wait to leave. But now I'm still triumphed. I still, shook his hand, and I told him I thoroughly enjoyed myself that week, and it was sincere. But the point that I want to make is this, that I predicted that would happen, because I've come to learn that, when you pray for God's grace, those are the type of things that happen. They do. I've had jobs that were odious to me, completely odious. Again, very powerful word. I don't use it all the time, but they've been perfectly odious to me. And yet, in praying for grace, somehow God gives you a peace and a joy in your heart, and it's not so bad. And actually, to tell you the truth, some of the worst jobs I've ever had, after I left them, I kind of missed them. I kind of missed them because I met with God on those jobs. And so the grace of God is greatly misunderstood today, because as it does certainly apply to our salvation, and God forgive me if I leave any other impression than that, it is, we are saved by the grace of God. But grace goes far beyond just our salvation. Grace is a day-to-day substance that we live with to help us to overcome our anxieties. This morning, Rebecca, before she sang her song, she mentioned, that I have told the girls ever since they were little, that peace is like a blanket. In fact, we used to call it the peace blanket. My girls, when they had anxiety, they would come to me and they'd say, "Daddy, please pray for the peace blanket." And so we pray for the peace blanket. I say, "Did you feel it?" And, I don't know whether they did or not, but I believe that they did. So as far as I was concerned, my part was done. But at any rate, grace comes. And there have been circumstances in my life where I have found the challenge to be greater than I could rise to. And yet, when you pray and you ask God and you kind of come pitifully to God, God imparts grace. And God gives us the ability to do what we can't do. Our dear brother Jeremy is teaching a very wonderful Sunday school, and I'm doing my very best to get him back into that role, getting my Sunday school wrapped up so he can get back into it. But maybe a month or so ago, he made a comment that actually sent me into the next couple of days just meditating on that comment alone, because I guess I knew it, but until somebody speaks it, you don't always put it in that context. And what he actually said was this, and I'll give you a quote. He said that grace is always given in full measure, not in partial measure. And somehow when he said that, that really resonated with me. And I thought to myself, you know what, that's right. God doesn't give it in partial measure. God gives it in full measure. And yet, somehow, if I'm perfectly honest, I experience it in partial measure sometimes. But the fault is not on God's part, because he gave it in full measure. God gives grace in full measure. In Galatians chapter 2, verse 21, just reading the first part of the verse, in Galatians chapter 2, verse 21, the Apostle Paul says, "I do not frustrate the grace of God." I do not frustrate the grace of God. And if I'm being honest with you tonight, I feel that in my life, I give you a testimony of an example where the grace was effective in my life, but I could give many testimonies where I feel as though I fell short of what grace intended. God doesn't give grace in partial measure, and yet I experience it in partial measure. Why? Because in some particular aspects of my life, I fear I may have frustrated its full potential. And it makes me pause. Because, this word frustrate that Paul uses in Galatians, the actual definition is to thwart the efficacy of anything, to nullify, to make it void, to frustrate it. To reduce the efficacy of it, to not walk in the fullness of it. I find a prayer formulating in my heart, Lord, let me give myself to the grace of God completely and entirely. Because God doesn't say, okay, he turns the spigot on a little ways and said, okay, that's enough. No, God gives grace in full measure. In other words, it is adequate for the task. It's adequate for the reason it was given. In Luke chapter 2 and verse 40, Luke chapter 2, verse 40, speaking of Jesus, it said, "And the child grew and waxed strong in spirit, filled with wisdom, and the grace of God was upon him." The grace of God was upon him. The grace of God was upon Christ as well as many other of the New Testament writers and saints. And the grace that was on them, was grace that was experienced in its full measure. It wasn't frustrated. It wasn't thwarted. It wasn't made less effective, through doubt, through disobedience, through whatever means, the enemy would use to thwart the grace of God. But the grace was given to enable Christ to fulfill his Father's will. And in his life, throughout his life, even from the time he was a babe, the grace of God was upon his life, and he grew with that grace. He grew with that grace. And that grace ultimately led him to the place whereby, even though he sweat drops of blood, he still found the grace to go to the cross. And because it was effective in his life and through his life, it became effective at the end of his life. Because he had made it his pattern to not frustrate the grace of God that was upon him. I see grace as an influence. It's a divine influence. Grace comes into our life to influence us. We get wounded, we get hurt, we get offended. Hopefully we won't get offended, but somebody tries to offend us. Or some trial comes into our life, or something comes to overcome us. But, following, Brother Jeremy's advice, which is excellent advice, the grace isn't given in partial measure. It's given in full measure to be effective. But may, in each of our lives, may we recognize the grace, and may we become familiar with the grace, and may we not frustrate the grace. Now, I know that verse has many applications, right? But I'm applying it in the sense of grace being an influence in our lives, right? Grace is an influence in our lives, and grace's influence is to give us the ability to do what we can't do in ourselves. That's exactly what the grace of God is for. In chapter 2, verse 40, the grace that's mentioned concerning the grace that grew in the life of Christ, if you go into the original Greek number 5485, if you want to look those things up, it says the spiritual condition of one governed by the power of divine grace. One governed by the power of divine grace. It's actually taken from a root word, which is G5463, again, if you want to look it up. And this is one of my absolute favorite definitions of grace entirely. And it is the divine influence upon the heart and its reflection in the life. The divine influence comes first, and then it's reflected in the life. It's outworked. It's living. It's a living epistle. It's alive. It's dynamic. If you look at someone who has been offended, and you look at somebody that has gotten off course because they've been offended, they have frustrated the grace of God. There's only one way that can happen, and that is if they did not take advantage of the grace that God made available in its full potential. That's not necessarily said to condemn them, woe is them. I feel grief in my heart, and I feel pity in my heart for those who are knocked off course by offense. But one can only conclude this, that they frustrated the grace that was made available to them. They were unable to appropriate that divine influence, the divine influence. I remember myself a time when somebody was they weren't doing it to offend me, but they were doing something that directly affected me. In a major way, actually. In a major way. And as I'm sitting there and I see the person coming to me, it conjured up the feelings that I had for that individual. It's not the same individual that I was auditing, a different individual. It conjured up those feelings in my heart again, and I thought, I didn't hate them. I didn't wish them evil, but it wasn't a pleasant experience by any stretch of the imagination. And then God spoke to me and he said, they're not your enemy. And you know what? That released me. The grace of God was imparted to me through that. And I found it easy, to just push it all aside. Just put it all away and just go on as though nothing had ever happened. The grace of God. The Apostle Paul understood that his ministry and his very life were the result of grace's influence. What are we called to do for God? I often say to myself, you look throughout the earth, and I literally this year I've had the privilege of traveling all the way around the world. I see people in corporate, circumstances all over the world, in France, in London, in Spain, in Ireland, all throughout the United States. I see people, and in my mind I think to myself, well, that's a tough job, that's a difficult job. And I calculate and I think to myself, what is the hardest job that I know of? Would it be a corporate CEO? Would it be an attorney? Would it be a doctor? Would it, be a judge? You know what I came to the conclusion of? The hardest job in the world is being a pastor. And I'm telling you the truth, you can't do it without grace. It can't be done. You see a pastor and they exercise their function with grace and with a certain amount of ease. Hopefully. I'm not speaking from experience, believe me. But, that job is really quite impossible unless there's grace. And so when you look at a pastor that's executing their job faithfully, you are seeing a witness and a manifestation of the grace of God. A manifestation of the grace. And the Apostle Paul understood. He said in Ephesians chapter 3 and verse 7, in Ephesians chapter 3 and verse 7, he said, whereof I was made a minister according to the gift of the grace of God given unto me by the effectual working of his power. We ought to see grace not just as an influence, but as a power. The grace comes to give us the ability to do what we cannot do in and of ourselves. It gives us the ability to do it. Now in 2 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 1, the Apostle Paul also says this, we then, as workers together with him, beseech you also that you receive not the grace of God in vain. Receive not the grace of God in vain. In other words, it's possible to receive the grace, appropriate the grace, and then fall short of what the grace intended in the end. It's possible. It's possible. The Apostle Paul said, don't receive the grace of God in vain. I see grace as the great influence of our day. It gives us the ability to do easily what we could never do in ourselves. Being insulted by other human beings, that may be one of the most difficult things to bear. And yet grace gives us the ability to do that. Challenges that we face in our everyday life that we can't do in ourselves. Grace gives us the ability to do it. And not only to do it, but sometimes to do it with joy. Again, referring to my friend, the client, I was thinking to myself, halfway through the week, I'm thinking to myself, I smiled to myself and I said, I knew this would happen. I knew this would happen. I'm having a great time with this guy. I'm having a great time with him. Well, in the very beginning when I first met him, I hadn't quite risen to that level of grace yet, and it was anything but fun. There's also a word that the Apostle Paul uses in Hebrews. We're gonna wrap this up shortly here, folks. In Hebrews chapter 10, in verse 29, it says, of how much sore punishment suppose ye shall he be thought worthy, who hath trodden under foot the Son of God, and hath counted the blood of the covenant wherewith he was sanctified an unholy thing, and catch this last phrase here, and hath done despite unto the Spirit of grace. Hath done despite unto the Spirit of grace. Has done despite unto the Spirit of grace. And this word despite, again, I'll give you the Greek, it's 1796. But this word despite actually means and has insulted the Spirit of grace. And the way that God quickened this to me, now you can disagree with this is just kind of a frankism here, but the way that it was quickened to me was the thought of, you have a friend who comes to do you some favor. He comes to your house, he knocks on your door, you open the door, and as soon as he starts speaking to you of this great gift that he's going to offer, I just had a great gift that was offered to me tonight. We're here. And as the great gift is about to be offered, the receiver slams the door in his face and walks away. And this is the idea here, that grace comes to be an influencer, to be a gift to enable us to overcome and to triumph. And yet, some throughout history have closed the door on that grace and have closed the door to that offer. And you know what God quickened to me as a good example of this? Bitterness. Bitterness. Bitterness is a good example of doing despite to the Spirit of grace, of insulting the Spirit of grace. That someone has received an offense, someone has, and you know what, by the way, generally speaking, when a person is offended, many times the offender did it maliciously. And so you feel, well, I have a right to be upset. They did it on purpose. Sometimes they didn't do it on purpose. Sometimes it was, they don't even know that they did it. And so, a person has like this self-justification thing that they go through. I have a right to be mad. Like Jonah sitting under the tree, the Lord, that conversation always amazed me. The Lord says, do you have a right to be angry? And his reply to the Lord is, I have every right to be angry. You really answer God like that? I have every right to be angry. I do well to be angry. But see, we have to be careful in that category because we might be insulting the Spirit of grace who wants to give us the ability to forgive and go on. This is one of the reasons why, the ministry should not be entered into without the grace of God and the gift of God being upon your life. What is the phrase, Jane? Jane has told me this all of my life. She's known me since I'm 18, so practically all my life. If you don't have a sense of humor, don't get into ministry. I've come to learn a little different adage than the one that Jane wisely shared with me, and that is this, that don't get into auditing if you don't have thick skin. Don't get into auditing if you don't have thick skin. But don't get into ministry. Now see, it really is quite a very serious thing. It really is quite a serious thing. When an event takes place in our life that's an upset, and maybe even the person that did it was malicious, in the end, we have to return forgiveness because that's what the grace pleads for in our lives. The grace is pleading with us to forgive, to forget, to put it aside. But if we hold on to the offense, if we hold on to the bitterness, we can do despite to the Spirit of grace. We can insult the Spirit of grace which has come. I remember somebody did something to me, and my attitude was I went to the Lord, and I said, Lord, look what they did. Look what they did, Lord. How could they do that to me? And, I was commiserating with the Lord, expecting God to comfort me and says, yes, that was a terrible thing, Frank, But you know what he said to me? He gave me the illustration, I think even Pastor might have alluded to it today or recently, but he gave me the illustration of, or maybe it was Danny last week, of the man who had a small debt that he was unwilling to forgive, and yet his master forgave him of some astronomical debt. And so when I went to the Lord and I said, look what they did, God reminded me of what I'd been forgiven for and said, now, isn't it really a small thing that I ask of you to forgive your brother? Isn't it really a small thing? Look at what I've forgiven you. Isn't it really a small thing? And it released me. It really did. It released me. And I just thought, I really have got no room for bitterness. I don't have any time for that. I don't really want that as part of my life. But you see from time to time that people have things happen to them. And I'm not talking about the world. We're talking about the saints. They have things happen to them, and they spend the next 10, 15, 20 years of their lives talking about that thing. One of the things that I thought was so beautiful about our own dear Pastor Bailey was that some man maligned him and did some evil things against him. And when the man came to ask for forgiveness as he was dying of cancer, Pastor Bailey's reply was, it was really easy to forgive him because I couldn't remember what he did. How beautiful is that? What a demonstration of grace that is. And yet we know of other examples. Again, one we heard recently from one of the ministers here, of a man, that's being pled with at the end of his life, saying, just forgive the offense. And the man held on to his bitterness and went to hell. It's like God coming to a believer with an offer of grace and the door being slammed shut. It's insulting the Spirit of grace. Now, if you were to sit down with any given individual who had been knocked off course because of bitterness, if you sat down with them and they explained to you in detail what led to their departure, you might even find it in your heart to agree with them and say, wow, that was bad. That was bad. What they did was wrong. That was a terrible, terrible thing. But who loses in the end? Do you get even with that person by holding bitterness? No, the only thing that happens is you insult grace and you put your own soul at risk. It's best just to get rid of those things. It's best just to let go of them. It's best just to let go. It's best just to let go. Forget about it. It's not important. It doesn't matter. It's insignificant. If we catch a glimpse of what we've been forgiven, it's meaningless. It's less than nothing. I was talking to a man one time and I said, you're going to go to hell over this. Well, I've got every right. It was a wrong thing. Well, it was a wrong thing. I admit it was a wrong thing. But who's losing in the end? It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. I mean, do you understand what I'm saying? It doesn't matter. What they do to you, it doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is our response to it. That's the only thing that matters. I remember, I'm almost finished here. We'll wrap it up. I know I said that already, but this time I mean it. I see a few smirks, but I do. One of the men who I never actually met, who had a tremendous influence on my young spiritual growth, was the man of God, Walter Butler. And if you hear Walter Butler's testimony, you understand, what it's like to be persecuted, not by the world, but being persecuted by your brethren. God gave the man a gift, a prophetic gift. God gave him unusual experiences with the Lord. And the other ministers, either through jealousy or hatred or whatever, did all kinds of unkind things to him. And he preached this one message, and it was called The Cost of Being a Prophet. And I think that every believer should listen to that message at least once. The Cost of Being a Prophet. It's available on YouTube. It's a beautiful, beautiful message about a man of God who suffered much in his ministry, giving a baccalaureate service to graduating Bible school students. And he's telling them how it really is. And it's about as honest a message, I think, as you'll ever hear. And one of the things he says in that message is, it doesn't matter what people do to you. It doesn't matter. And he was a man that had experienced hatred by his brethren, by those that were over him. In fact, he said that if you are not able to take being hated by people, then do yourself a favor. Don't get into ministry at all. In fact, he goes as far as to say this: sometimes you are hated by people for whom you have a particular fondness. People that you love who treat you ill. And he says, watch it. If you don't have a mechanism to deal with that and find grace, it will knock you off course. It will knock you off course. Hebrews chapter 12, verse 15. This is actually my last verse. Looking diligently, lest any man fail of the grace of God, lest any root of bitterness springing up trouble you, and thereby many be defiled. And that word defiled it doesn't just simply mean spots on your garment. It actually has a very serious connotation to it, whereby you'll be left with the impression that they perished, that they actually went to hell over it because of a root of bitterness. Well, what is grace? Wrapping it up here. I'm going to put my notes away so you'll understand this is definitely the last verse. So what is the grace of God? Well, we are saved through grace by faith. It is the gift of God and not of ourselves. That's true, and maybe, we would say that that is the most important interpretation of grace, at least as far as coming into the kingdom is concerned. But what is grace after we've been born again? Grace is a divine influence. Grace gives us the ability to do what we can't do ourselves. But we have to receive it. We have to embrace it. We have to apply it. We've got to let grace have its complete work. As our dear brother Jeremy said, grace is not given in partial measure. It's given in full measure. And so we want to experience it in its fullness. Amen? Amen. God bless.